In our course, we mainly use the base graphics package for graphics, and that's mainly because it uses the same sort of syntax as the rest of R, but a lot of R users tend to prefer the ggplot2 package, and it does have some advantages compared to the base package graphics. And although we're not including it in the course, I thought it might be a good idea to give you a brief introduction to the package and give some examples of how to use it. The ggplot2 syntax is largely based on something called the Grammar of Graphics. That's a book written by Leland Wilkinson, and it's a sort of grammar for how to translate data into graphics in a rather intuitive way. And the basic idea is that you create graphics stepwise rather than working from the inside out as you tend to do in R. But you start out with the plot, and then you add something called layers, one after the other, to this plot in order to develop it into what you're looking for. And one of the great advantages of ggplot2 is that the syntax might be considered a bit more intuitive, and it's more compliant with the way you develop the graphs step by step. It also has a lot of functionality that makes this better suited for data exploration. For example, it's rather easy to associate data in your data set to aspects of the graphics, such as colors, shape of lines, and plot characters and so forth. And it also has automatic legends when you connect some sort of data to the output. Also, the default settings in ggplot2 tend to be better looking than its counterparts in the base package. On the negative side, the syntax is rather different, I think, from what you're used to in R, so you would have to learn two ways of looking at things, and also, of course, there are a lot of new commands that you have to learn in order to master ggplot2. Syntax-wise, you have two commands, ggplot and qplot, which lets you start a new plot in ggplot2. The qplot is short for quick plot and has a lot of default settings, while ggplot doesn't. You also have something called S, which is short for aesthetic or aesthetics, which lets you map the data to the plot, like telling R what column in your data set refers to the X value and so forth. You then add different layers. One such kind of layer is the geometrics. The geometrics are layers that tell what kind of plot you're making, like, for example, the scatter plot, box plot, bar plot. Another class of layers are the scales that links the data to various aspects of the output, color, point sizes, etc. and also lets you change the axis and other things. And you then have themes which control aspects of the output that is not directly data connected, such as the plot size, the margins, the background color, and you have a lot more layers as well. And to make a plot, you start by initializing the plot using the ggplot or qplot commands, and you may also at this stage use the aesthetic to connect the output to some data that you're interested in plotting. You then add layers one after another and evaluate the results, and go on doing this until you have the plot you want. In ggplot2 you can also store the plot itself in an object at any stage, and this object can then be recalled, producing or reproducing the plot. And you may also use the object to add layers to it. So you can start with a sort of half-cooked plot and add new layers to that object. And if you want to export the plot to something like TIFF, JPEG, PostScript, or whatever, you can save the object using ggSave, so you don't have to open a device and remember to close it afterwards, as in base package. Here I'll give a very brief example of how to make a plot in ggplot2, and you'll notice that it differs quite a lot from the way you make plots in base package. You start by loading the library ggplot2, which you obviously will have to install before. And then in this case we read the dataset, the Warfarin dataset that we used a lot, into memory and put it in the object D. And then if we want to plot, for example, a scatter plot with the INR on day 7 on the x-axis and the Warfarin dose on the y-axis, we can use the command ggplot data D, that's the data set, and then we use mapping. Then we will have to use this command S here, telling R that in this case we have an X and a Y value for this plot, and we explain that X is INR 7, that's the column name, and Y is dose, which is another column. And if we run this part, we get an empty plot window like this. We can then add something. We add a geometry here, geom point, which is basically scattered plot. And as you see, you don't have to use any arguments here because you've already told R that the X and the Y values refer to these columns. So if you run this part, you get a scatter plot. And as you can see, there is some sort of relationship between these two. It's also possible to store the entire plot in an object, as I mentioned. In this case, we put it in my plot, like this. So now it's in my plot. And if I would run only the my plot here, we would get the graph once again. I can then take my plot and add, in this example I add something called scale y log 10, because I want to have a logarithmized y-axis. So if I run this part, I get the plot once again, but as you can see here we have a logarithmized y-axis. And then I may add, with the plus sign here, I add another scale layer for a logarithmized x-axis. And I also want this to go from 0.9 to 10, so I add a limits argument to the log 10 command. And now we have logarithmized axes, both x and y. Then it might be nice to have some sort of ticks here, and there is a thing called annotation log ticks, which I can add. So if I run these 3 lines of code, I get ticks here as well, as you can see. And then I want to change the labels on the axis here to INR and dose milligram per week. And then I can use the labs command. So I add the labs command, and its arguments are x and y, referring to the 2 axes, like this. As you can see, we have new axis labels. And then I want to increase the size of them, and then I can use the theme command. That's a theme layer. And the theme layer enables you to change a lot of things, but in this case we want to change only the axis title. And we would have to write like this: element text size 15. And you might suspect that this would give you really large letters, because like 15 times the original size, but that's not the case, since in ggplot2 this refers to the point size. That's the typographic point size. So if I run this, you can see the INR and this label here got a little bigger. And finally, I would like to add a regression line, and I can then use a layer called a stat layer for statistics. So we have something called stat smooth, and in this case we want the method linear model. So I add that as well. There are other kinds of regression lines here. And what I get is a regression line, and per default it's blue, and you also, as a default, get a confidence interval for the slope of the regression line.